Hello, everyone, and welcome to Art of the Week with Katya, episode 11. Now, this episode is a very special episode. You are joining me in the complex of Santa Maria Assunta, the Church of Torcello. Here is the Church of Santa Maria Assunta di Torcello. And so this church is located on the island of Torcello, once a power of this lagoon, the lagoon that Venice is currently located in, the Venetian lagoon. But now it currently only has 12 inhabitants. And this church is very much part of the founding story of Venice, that the Doges of the 12th century wrote down originally. And it was believed for many years that this more or less was the history of Venice. The original church was built here in 639. But we know that historians have realized that it would have been impossible for this island to have been populated solely by migrations that came from the mainland, which was part of the original story, that it was migrations that came from the mainland who were running away from the Goths, from the various attacks of the Longobards at the time, which was during this time. However, recent studies have revealed that there had to have been a population who lived here already that would have been increasing over time. And we do know from various Byzantine manuscripts that this also was very much true. So the current church that I have shown you, this church, due to an earthquake, was rebuilt in the year 1008. But the Carolingian original pieces still remain. So let's have a look. This here is the Basilica of Santa Fosca. It is an octagonal church with a central nave like most Carolingian churches. And we can see from this outer wall here some of the similar patterns that we have here in this church. Now, this is actually one of the Sette Chiese in Bologna, specifically the octagonal central naved Carolingian church of the Sette Chiese. As you saw, it's very similar in its architecture and in the triangles that are outside on the brick that you can see in Santa Fosca. And Santa Fosca is right next to the church, the Basilica style church of Santa Maria Assunta, which has a central nave and two aisles, but we'll get a better look into its plan later. And as I said, it was rebuilt a little bit later. So it's actually a Romanesque church, the building that is currently standing there. But it definitely has some of its original Carolingian pieces to it, and this is just one of them. Now, it's time to go inside. So on the inside, there's so much to talk about. We're going to start with the pavimenti, with the floor, and you can see this alone is an extraordinary masterpiece in mosaic. And people, hundreds of thousands of people have walked all over this for centuries now. I mean, this is over 1,000 years old, this pavimento. And you see the beautiful gracefulness of the lines, of especially the incredible geometries of the stone, which is very similar to what we can see here in the Cappella Palatina in Sicily. Now, these churches are similar in that they were built around the same time. Now, they're a bit different though. This is a wall in the Cappella Palatina. The Cappella Palatina, and someday I will do a glorious episode that is as dedicated to this amazing chapel as it is dedicated to the amazingness of Santa Maria Assunta in Torcello. But you can see the design of these stones. They show a similar angularity and a similar geometry, but it is much, much, much more elaborate. And that's due to other influences, Ifiquid influences that are also in the Cappella Palatina that we do not have here. As we can see, going back to Santa Maria Assunta, the floor is geometric, yes, but it also has a certain more flowing nature to it, because the symbology, in fact, is Roman, is not from an Islamic empire in this particular case. And we can also note that while in Sicily, as you saw in that photograph, there were two different types of stones. There was a special red marble, and that was actually that panel is right next to a large block of porphyry, which is the purplish stone on the left-hand side. We don't have quite that, we don't have porphyry in the floors of Torcello. Porphyry, by the way, is considered the marble of emperors. It's an incredibly brittle marble that can only be found in Egypt. And the first porphyry was mined and carried to Constantinople for the Emperor Constantine, which is why it became known for that. It is definitely a very precious stone. And we do not have that in these floors. In fact, the red that you're seeing is a red that comes from a very specific marble that comes from Verona, so from this region, very specifically. And so that's what you're seeing here. So we start very much in the realm of earth. Now, moving on, we get to the screen that is in front of the altar. And I'm going to get into, we will have a further episode that just delves directly into the significance of the altar screen. But we can see in this one that the way that this one is created, it has these marble slabs at its base, which are really quite interesting. Now, they're interesting from multiple perspectives. From an architectural perspective, we also see this in San Marco, as you can see here on the left and right-hand sides. You can see the same types of marble slabs. And what these are, in fact, these are recycled pieces of sarcophagi that have been reused and reattached to create these slabs in these church walls, as you saw in San Marco and as you can see in Santa Maria Assunta. And we're looking at a particular one here that shows two peacocks in front of the vine. But before we get into that, we can see from San Marco and from Santa Maria Assunta as well, from the way that these two these two churches are built, that the phenomena of recycling these tombs is really an important thing here in the Venetian area. You don't see this in Sicily, you don't see this in other churches in Italy. It's very specific to here. And that's very interesting. It certainly announces the similarities between San Marco and Santa Maria Assunta, but there are many. Now, moving back onto this particular piece, we see two peacocks here that are facing each other. They are surrounded by these very elaborate vine details. Now, these sarcophagi, which do not match, by the way, because they're various pieces of various sarcophagi, so they don't all have the same image on them. We see these two peacocks here in front of these grapevines, and they are facing each other in a very symmetrical way. Now, this is very reminiscent of pre-iconoclastic Byzantine art. Now, if we remember, this means it had to have been created before the 8th century, before the 780s, when the first iconoclasm part of that era happens, if we remember from our first episode. And the thing about this, so these are pieces of sarcophagi that would have been made during that time. Of course, the pieces are not symmetrical themselves, so they're pieces of various sarcophagi. They don't match up in the structure. And this is very much reminiscent of a different time. What is interesting, though, about this particular symbology, which is found on these sarcophagi, is that this particular symbology, the symbology of the peacock, actually has its origins in the ancient Romans. And we can see, for example, in the sarcophagus of Bologna, the sarcophagus of San Vitale, of the Church of San Vitale in Agricola in Bologna, the symbol of the peacock, which for the ancient Romans was also incredibly spiritual, as well as the dark blue feathers of the peacock were believed to access the night sky, were invoking of the night sky, and therefore they were considered a highly celestial bird. So they would be put sometimes on Roman sarcophagi. And if you know very much about ancient Roman burial rituals, sarcophagi are only for the most noble. So this was a tradition already in ancient Rome that was appropriated by the early Christians. As we can see, San Vitale was a martyr in the 300s, so before Christianity was even allowed in these areas. And we can see from the sarcophagus, it's very faint, but you can see it, the two peacocks facing each other, which was the ancient Roman way. Now, in this case, we have the two peacocks in front of the vine. So I would say that this sarcophagus was made a little bit later, probably in the 500s or 600s, pre-iconoclasmic era, of course. But with having the vines present, the vines represent the Eucharist. So the two peacock symbol has changed, has moved from its particularly ancient Roman significance into a significance to do with Christianity. Now, the peacock was also considered, due to its plumage and its colors and the fact that it was used as the symbol of nobility and of celestiality by the ancient Romans. When it was brought into Christianity, the peacock symbolizes the Garden of Eden, which is accessible, of course, through the Eucharist, through the sacrament of remembering the sacrifice of Christ, which brings us, or the person who would have occupied this tomb, into the Garden of Eden. Now, what is interesting is that from the Carolingian perspective, this has a very specific meaning as well, because actually Charlemagne himself in the Church of Aachen had two live peacocks in his garden, because he tried at that time to recreate a Garden of Eden. My point is, the reuse of these tombs is neither random, nor is it without just for recycling good stone, which of course is part of it. But it's also because the decoration of this is actually very important to the church and to church ritual. This screen is the division between the altar space, the holy space, and the space of the parishioners, because it was, and as I said, I'm going to get further into that later, but this is an important barrier here, and it's a barrier that is describing a little bit a barrier almost between heaven and earth. But what is interesting is that it's also a bit of a gray area between heaven and earth, and this is what happens when we stay on the terrain, stay on terra, but we're going to move into the altar space. So moving now into the altar space, we're going to look at the mosaics later, but staying on the terra, staying on the earth, we notice these stone patterns that are surrounding these steps, these special steps and these railings that seem to go up. Now, the steps and the railings would have led to the throne of Charlemagne, which, as you can see by this image, has been moved outside. This is huge. This is a huge signifier that this church, the original church that was built here, was a Carolingian church, because we do not have special thrones for the bishopric or for any other hierarchy in the church. Does not exist, does not happen, it does not manifest itself into real life before Charlemagne. Charlemagne is the first one to create something like this, again in Aachen, And it is not until the Carolingians that we have something like this. So this is from the Carolingians. These steps are from the Carolingians. The railings are from the Carolingians. The throne is from the Carolingians. This was a Carolingian church. Now, behind it, we see these stones. And these stones are cut in a very interesting way. This is a special kind of marble that has been cut in a way, as you can see, the patterns are perfectly matching each other one for one. And this is called book match cutting because the stone is in one piece. It is cut down the middle, vertically down the middle, so it's split in half exactly. And as I have mentioned, marble is a very brittle stone. With this being the case, and this being the Middle Ages, of course, cutting the stone in a book match type of cut, it could not have a single flaw. Because the book match cut, as you can see, it not only reveals a mirroring pattern that is perfectly mirroring, but it reveals the way in which the earthen lava is cooled in order, and it's preserved of its original patterns. The liquidity of the patterns in the stone is what is very important here, because again, this is not just a random technique. This was a technique that was first used, and what you're looking at here is the floor of none other than Holy Wisdom herself, Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. This pattern was first used on the flooring of Hagia Sophia, and it was used for a very specific reason. It was used to signify on the floor the seas of the earth that was to mirror the gold of the mosaics of the heavens. And as I said, we'll get to the heavens in a moment. We're going to stay on earth for now. As you can see by this flooring, again, the liquidity, the grayness of the stone, it truly is attempting to mimic earth and the earthly, the earthness. And again, this is restating the point, the fact that in Christianity, the idea of bringing the divine into the earthly and bringing the earthly to the divine. And as I said, we've entered into this space, this almost Eden-like space, which is made of both. It's made of earth and it's made of heaven. And it's meant to be a bit of a symbol of both. And we're dealing with the bishop here. The bishop is still human. That's another thing. Charlemagne, as the Holy Roman Emperor, he was in a very interesting position because he wasn't exactly, he was the Pope of his empire, but he also never takes the place of Christ. So he is not the human representative of God or anything like that. But what he is he was a step above in the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. And that's why he had his own throne that was separate from the papal throne, because he was showing his title as the Holy Roman Emperor. And of course, this would be a debate that would take centuries to undo itself. But back to our church, Santa Maria Assunta. So we have this, as we know, this book match cut marble here. And this is a very difficult, very, very difficult technique that was done, as we can see, multiple times behind the throne, describing the seas of the earth and invoking Hagia Sophia, which I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but this was the church that Charlemagne was trying to get to. And in fact, the island of Torcello is the farthest he got, as close to Constantinople as he ever got as a Holy Roman Emperor. The reason he was trying to get to Constantinople was because he believed himself to be the heir of Constantine. And in order to get as close to that as possible, he was trying to actually geographically get as close as he could. So we can see, even though the church was rebuilt, it was definitely rebuilt with some very similar influences that even the Carolingians would have had. We have some influences from the West. We saw the mosaics of the Roman, with the Roman and the Western, very naturalistic influence. But we also see a highly symbolic and highly naturalistic influence that comes from Byzantium that is also very prominently shown in this church.